Hello, and welcome to Soothing Pod's Sleep Stories. Tonight, I have a wonderful story for you. But the best way to enjoy it is to first get cozy in your bed. Tuck your toes under the blanket. Make sure you have your favorite plush toy beside you. Go ahead and give it a great big hug. Let it lie on your pillow and feel your own head rest on the pillow. It's nice to snuggle up with your plush toy, right? Now, we're going to take a big, deep breath, because when you breathe in slowly and deeply, it helps all of the muscles in your body relax. And when your muscles are relaxed, you get a better sleep. So here we go. Big breath of air in, and big breath of air out. If you hold one hand over your tummy when you breathe in, you should be able to feel it getting bigger. Kind of like when you blow up a balloon. Can you feel it? Let's try again. Big breath in, feel your tummy get big. Big breath out, and tummy gets smaller. One last time. Inhale and exhale. And now, I think you're relaxed and ready for the story. So, let's begin. Many years ago, when some grown-ups still believed in magic, there were 3 children: Wendy, John, and Michael Darling. The Darling family lived in London on a busy, bustling street. On that busy, bustling street, there was a tall tree, and on that tree lived a wise old owl. He never slept at night, you know. He was always wide awake, perched on the tree branch, watching the world pass by at a slower pace. Often, before bedtime, the 3 Darling children would play together in their bedroom, imagining that they were pirates, or fairies, or flying birds and alien things. The wise old owl sometimes listened as the children played, for among all the sounds he loved was the sound of happy children laughing. Sometimes, Mother Darling would knock on the door. "Settle down, children," she would say. "It's almost time for bed." And then, Mother Darling would remind them to brush their teeth, pick up all the books and clothes scattered on the floor, and make sure that their school books and backpacks were prepared properly for the next day. But sometimes, Mother Darling would not knock at all. She would let them play a little bit longer, for she knew that the children were still children after all. And children need playtime as much as they need sleep. So, on some nights, she would let the grandfather clock tick-tock just a little past 8, and wait 5 extra minutes before knocking on the door. It was on one of those nights, when the streets below still clattered with jingling sounds of horse carriages passing, that the 3 Darling children were playing 5 minutes longer. Wendy, whose real name was Wendy Moira Angela Darling, was pretending to be a flying unicorn. She had on her rainbow-coloured unicorn hairband her glittery dress, and her rainbow-coloured cotton socks. John Darling, whose real name was John Napoleon Darling, was pretending that he was a powerful, courageous knight. He wielded a plastic sword, tipped his paper crown back in place, and hopped from bed to bed, as if slaying terrible, invisible dragons. And there was little Michael Nicholas Darling. He was the smallest of the Darlings, but you know how sometimes the smallest ones can be the loudest. That's exactly how it was with little Michael. He was pretty good at laughing loud, and crying loud, and snoring loud too. Tonight, Michael Darling was pretending to be a very loud circus clown. "Watch me juggle, Wendy and John," he called in his circus clown voice, tossing 3 bright blue balls over their heads. Once the ball bounced up, bounced down, and then bounced right back up again, landing on the windowsill. The children laughed, and no one, except the little ball, noticed a grey shadow silently slipping through a crack in the window. The shadow, whose form was quite like a boy's, scooted across the window, slipped down the wall, moved over the carpeted floor, and then jumped right into the open sock drawer, where Wendy Moira Angela Darling kept her rainbow-coloured cotton socks. There, the shadow stayed. Until 5 hours later. Many of the streetlights outside had flickered off. The grown-ups had retired to bed, and all the children in London were fast asleep. All the children, including Wendy, John, and Michael. And that was when the little shadow decided to slip out of the sock drawer. But it was also when something else slipped through the Darling family's window. A tiny little golden light. The golden light seemed to tinker like a bell as it whizzed through the window, swirled around the bedroom, zipped this way and that way in the darkness, and finally settled right on the sock drawer where the shadow was. Someone else was at the window. A boy wearing a green cap, green tunic, and green pants. He lifted the window up easily and flew, yes, flew, right to where the light and the shadow were. "Aha, now we've found you," the boy grinned. All at once, that tinkering light turned into the most beautiful little fairy you ever saw. Big, bold eyes, pink, puckered lips, and golden, glittering hair. "Great job, Tinkerbell," said the boy. "We've found you at last, Shadow." The boy opened up the drawer, and it rattled in protest as he pulled on the handle. The shadow jumped right out, up onto the wall. The boy tried to grab the shadow, but it was impossible. The shadow slipped away. The boy and the fairy chased the shadow around and around the room, round and round, and round and round. Shadow wouldn't stop moving around, but the boy wouldn't give up. All this commotion was unusual at this time of night. Wendy, who had already had a hard time getting sleep because of little Michael's snoring, opened her eyes. With her 2 fists, she rubbed her eyelids and squinted. The bedroom was usually dark and quiet during the night, with only the moonlight's glow outside the window. But now, what was this? A tiny light hopping back and forth, flying above her head. And a boy? Wendy sat straight up in bed to make sure she wasn't dreaming. But it was a boy, and she really was awake. Her brothers, John and Michael, were still sleeping. Wendy watched as the boy in the light flew around her room. She watched until she noticed the light changed into a tiny fairy. She watched until she could keep quiet no longer. "Who are you?" Wendy spoke, finally. The boy turned to her. The fairy turned to her. The boy smiled and extended his hand. "The name's Peter. Peter Pan," he replied. "And this is my friend Tinkerbell. And this is my shadow." Peter Pan grasped at the air. And then Wendy saw it, the wriggling, wobbly shadow, trying to get away from the boy's grasp. "Oh, he's a naughty little shadow," said Peter Pan. "He won't stick to me." Wendy laughed. Peter laughed. And the naughty shadow seemed to laugh too. "You see? I told you he was a naughty shadow," Peter Pan said. "Maybe I can help you get him to stick," said Wendy. She got up out of bed and took out her sewing box. It was full of bright-coloured yarn balls, buttons, and needles. Wendy was good at making stuff. In fact, she had made her own unicorn headband and her own rainbow-coloured cotton socks. She had stitched the night costume which her brother John wore, and had also made a clown nose for her brother Michael out of a handmade red pom-pom ball. "Maybe I can sew your shadow back on," said Wendy to Peter. "Now that is a fantastic idea," said Peter. "But you haven't told me your name yet." "Wendy Moira Angela Darling," Wendy replied, "but you can just call me Wendy." "All right, Wendy," said Peter. "Nice to meet you, Wendy." "And I'm Michael." Everyone turned to look at little Michael Darling, who was now sitting up in bed. "I'm 4 years old," he called out loud. "He's my brother," explained Wendy. "And my other brother John is there." She pointed to the pile of blankets on her brother's bed. "Nice to meet you all," said Peter Pan. "Now, you say you can fix my shadow." "I'll sure try," said Wendy. She opened up her sewing box, found the perfect sized needle, and a spool of dark green thread, the same colour as Peter Pan's shoes. Turning on a night lamp, she threaded the needle, knotted it, and asked Peter Pan to give her both his shoes. In no time at all, Wendy had sewn the shadow back onto Peter Pan's shoes. He slipped his feet back into them, hopped up onto the bed beside her, and tested it by doing a little kick dance to see if the shadow would get away. Not this time. The shadow stuck quite well, because of Wendy's fine, just right stitches. Peter Pan was very pleased. Wendy was very pleased. The shadow, well, it had no choice. "Thanks, Wendy, for fixing my shadow." "You're welcome, Peter," smiled Wendy. Peter threw his arms around Wendy for a big hug. And what do you know? Tinkerbell was not very pleased. The little fairy whirled around in protest, perhaps unhappy that Peter had found a new friend, and worried that he might not fly around with her so much anymore. "Oh, Tink," said Peter Pan. Tinkerbell had nothing to worry about. Peter Pan had lots of friends, but he would always love Tinkerbell the most. Peter Pan turned to Wendy. "Come away with us," said Peter. "For just one night, come with us to Neverland." "Neverland?" asked Wendy. "But I've never heard of it. I've never heard of Neverland either." They all turned to see John, who was now also sitting up in bed, with a look of wonder on his face. "And I never heard of Neverland either," called the third voice, this time much louder. It was little Michael. "Never heard of Neverland? Well, that's a first," Peter Pan replied in disbelief. The three children shook their heads. "Oh, then I must tell you all about it," cried Peter. "Neverland is the happiest place in all the universe. It is also an amazing adventure land. There lives a princess, Tiger Lily, my friends the Lost Boys, and all sorts of magical creatures. I was born in Neverland, and I'll never ever leave it. Well, except for when my shadow gets away." The three darling children were listening, wide-eyed. "So, what do you say? Would you like to come with me to Neverland?" asked Peter Pan. "Sure, but how do we get there?" asked Wendy. "Is there a nighttime train?" "Trains are for slow folk," smiled Peter Pan. "We get to fly." And at that last word, fly, Peter Pan flew straight up to the ceiling. All three children gasped in surprise. "You can fly!" they all said in unison. "Oh, of course, and so can Tinkerbell, and so can you." "Oh no, we can't," said John, who always thought things through. "I'll teach you," replied Peter. And he started to sing a little song. "Now listen close and gather round. I'll tell you exactly how I found the secret of the bumblebee, the soaring winds, Tinkerbell and me. You think a happy thought, and then you think about it once again. As soon as that thought becomes a smile, you'll find you can fly for over a mile." "That's it? Just a happy thought?" said Michael, who wasn't so sure. "Well, that's it," replied Peter Pan. "But they must be happy thoughts that rhyme." "Well, let me try," said Wendy, and she started to think of a happy thought poem. She thought about her mother darling and all the things she loved to do. "Chocolate cookies, skies that are blue, happiness is holding hands with you." At that moment, Wendy's feet lifted up off the ground a little. She gasped in happy surprise and wiggled her toes. She went straight up. She continued to rhyme. Snowflakes for days, pumpkin pie pots, mother and father, and pink polka dots, rainbow unicorns, glittery glue. Flying is, well, pretty easy to do. "What did I tell you?" laughed Peter Pan. "Now you try, little Michael." "Yes, Michael, try to rhyme and try to fly," said Wendy. She was still floating up above the bookshelf. Little Michael gave it a go. Okay, building my blocks, stacking beach rocks." And then Michael lifted up off the carpet a little. "Circus clowns, teddy bears, magic shows, crunchy pears." Now he floated all the way to the top of the room. Michael laughed and told his big brother to try it too. And so John, who usually never listened to Michael, decided to, just this once. "Soccer, summer, marshmallows, ice cream, racing cars, trucks, and climbing up trees, fishing with Dad, Mummy not mad." Wendy gave a little giggle at that last nice thought, and up went John, up, 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 until he was on the same level above as his sister and brother. "Now we can fly!" all three darling children sang together. "If you can imagine happy things, those thoughts lift you up and give you wings," sang Peter Pan. But just then, as quickly as they started to float, they began to sink. First it was Wendy, who landed on the bed. Then Michael lost his flying balance too and sank to a pillow. Unfortunately, John's landing wasn't so soft. Oof! He hit his chin on the carpeted floor as he fell. Poor John, poor Wendy, poor Michael, poor darling children." Tinkerbell shook her head. She rolled her eyes, for she knew better. "Of course you just can't fly by thinking happy thoughts." It was Peter Pan who came to his senses. "But of course," Peter Pan echoed Tinkerbell's feelings. She knew all along what the real secret was. Well, there were 3 secrets, in fact. Peter Pan held his hands out to the children and lifted them up to standing position as he sang another rhyme. "Well, I'll admit, in order to fly, there are 3 more things that you should try. A dash of hope, a pinch of trust, and a sprinkle of magic fairy dust." "A dash of hope, a pinch of trust, and a sprinkle of magic fairy dust," echoed Wendy. When she had said those last 2 words, fairy dust, Peter Pan beamed. He flew over to where Tinkerbell was sitting on the draw ledge, got down on one knee, and begged the little sulking fairy, "Oh, Tinkerbell, please won't you share some fairy dust?" Tinkerbell loved Peter Pan so much, she knew that she would always do whatever he said. He didn't even have to beg. And so she agreed, flittering, fluttering, hovering her silvery wings over the children. And with a flick of her slender fingers, she showered all 3 darling children with a great big pile of fairy dust. "Oh, Tinkerbell, it's so pretty!" exclaimed Wendy. She thought that she had never seen such sparkly glitter in all her life. As the tinkling fairy dust settled all over the children, in their hair, and on the tips of their eyelashes, and even on John's freckled nose, they began to fly, and fly, and fly, and fly, until Wendy Darling, and John Darling, and little Michael Darling flew right out the window. Swoosh into the starry sky. Swoosh into the magical moonlight. Swoosh. Peter Pan flew right along with them, taking Wendy's hand in his as he passed. The cobblestone street below began to look further and further away. The parked cars seemed to shrink. The treetops now appeared as bushes in the distance. The school building, and the post office, and city hospital nearby, they all grew smaller and smaller and smaller. The 3 darling children couldn't believe their eyes or their bodies. What a beautiful feeling this was, to fly over the rooftops of houses, over the lakes, and over the clouds. They all felt as if they could fly forever. "We can fly, we can fly, we can fly," all 3 children chanted in unison. "Oh yes, you sure can," said Peter Pan. "And now you can fly all the way to Neverland." "Hooray!" shouted little Michael. "Well, I can't wait to see the other planets," called out John. And Wendy's heart grew warm at this new feeling of no weight holding her down at all. "I can't wait to see Neverland," she whispered, to nobody in particular. That starry night in London, no one noticed the 3 darling children flying away. No one, that is, except for the wise old owl, who was still awake. He had been listening to their laughter, their rhyming, their joy, and it made him tuck some extra happiness inside his feathers too. The wise old owl saw the children fly out of the window and over the moon. The wise old owl gave a hoot. Hoo, hoo! It's nice to think of things that give you happiness and wings. The owl winked, and the moon winked back. It rose higher in the sky, as the children kept on flying. They followed Peter Pan and Tinker Bell, leaving the sleeping city behind and soaring off to a new adventure. And if you want to hear about the rest of their adventure in Neverland, well, you'll have to come back for another sleep story. Because now, it's time for you to dream a little dream of your own, to find happy thoughts of your own, to close your eyes and drift off into a magical place, where many more stories are waiting just for you. And who knows how high you might fly in your dreams. I hope you enjoyed this bedtime story. See you next time on Soothing Pod.